The Hand by Wessel Hyatt Smitter. Tomorrow morning at 9, I have to go to the courthouse and get up in front of the coroner and tell how it happened. If I tell what I saw, they will put Bulgarian Bill in the big house for life. If I tell what I know about the murder, I would have to put most of the blame on the machine, and they would think I was crazy. It's going to be a tough job. There ought to be laws for machines the same as for people, not for machines that grind crankshafts and bore holes in pistons, and that run with belts from the ceiling, not even for gear-cutting machines that have their own electric motors, and that can do automatically almost everything that has to be done into a gear except wrapping it in brown paper. These machines can only do one thing, and that's all. They work on production. But for machines like the one Bulgarian Bill ran, a machine that's got hundreds of electric motors and rheostats and switches and magnets, and that's got electric juice running all through it from one end to the other, that's got dozens of control levers where the juice comes out in your hands and gets into your blood and your brain and makes you do things you wouldn't do if you had your right sense, that can pick up a 5-ton piece of hot steel and fool around with it the way you would with a brick. For machines like that, there ought to be laws, the same as for people. The engineers who came and set the machine up in the factory said it was called a manipulator. We called it the Hand. It ran on a track, and there was a long arm that went in and out and could swing around in a circle. And at the end of the arm there was a wrist and a hand with an iron thumb and finger. It was used for picking up big chunks of steel and sticking them into the furnaces and taking them out and holding them under the hammer. When the engineers got it set up, they went away, and the fellow we took to calling Bill came from the factory where it was made, and he ran it. The very first day there was trouble between the Bulgarian and Pete, one of our trick machine men. We were having our lunch, and Pete opened his dinner bucket and took out a couple of hard-boiled eggs. "Eggs again," said Pete. "Always they have to give me hard-boiled eggs." "You don't like eggs," said the Bulgarian. "Like 'em all right," said Pete. "Only thing is, it's too much trouble to crack 'em." Pete got up and went to the hammer. He picked up a handful of iron dust from the floor and made a little pile on the anvil and set the egg on top of it. He turned on the steam and the big hammer that was 20 feet high and sat on a slab of concrete under the ground that was as big as a house, and it was built to strike 3,000-ton blows, started bobbing up and down, smooth and easy. He let it warm up for maybe a minute, and then he shot the big piston down, and the hammer just nicked the egg. It cracked the same as it would if you had knocked it against your knee. Then he cracked the other egg the same way. Pete held the eggs out for the Bulgarian to see. "But I cracked them, didn't I?" he said. "Yeah," said the Bulgarian. "Nice little trick. How long you practice, huh? Or how long you practice him?" The Bulgarian finished eating his noodles, and then he got up and took a watch out of his pocket. It was one of those you buy in a drugstore for $1.29. "Nice little trick, that one," he said. "But I show you one that is better." He held out the watch for Pete to look at. "See," he said, "the glass is not cracked. Now I will crack it, and the watch will continue to run." He went to the hammer and turned on the steam and started to fool around with the controls. There was some tape on the lever, and he asked Pete if he could take it off, and Pete answered short and said yes, but that he would have to put it back on. He took off the tape and then fooled around some more, getting the feel of the lever, sending the hammer up and down in long, easy strokes, but not letting it quite touch the anvil. Then he stopped it and cleaned off the dirt and laid the watch on the anvil with the face up and started the hammer. Now you'll see how they make tinfoil," said Pete. That's what we expected to see, but we didn't. The hammer slid up and down, smooth as lightning. The Bulgarian had his fingers wrapped around the bare iron lever. He had his feet wide apart and his eye on the watch, on the anvil, and you could hear the steam sing in the pipes. And then the piston reached out a long stroke, and we knew he'd done it. He shut her off and took up the watch and showed it to us, and we saw that it was running, and that there were 4 even cracks in the glass. When there is only one thing you can do well, and you think you can do that one thing better than anyone else, and then somebody comes along and makes you look like a piker, It makes you feel pretty tough. Pete thought he was about the best hammer man in the factory, but the Bulgarian put Pete in the shade, and he felt mean about it. "In the factory where they make these steam hammers," said the Bulgarian, "I worked before coming to work here. Steam is like a young lion locked in a cage. Electricity is like a man and the devil in one person. Electricity I like better." When he grabs himself a handful of waste and wipes the dirt and grease off the wheels and gears of his machine. With that, he grabs himself a handful of waste and wipes the dirt and grease off the wheels and gears of the machine. In the afternoon, the Bulgarian and Pete were working on a piece of hot steel, and they had it under the hammer, and the Bulgarian missed a signal, and Pete called out a name. The Bulgarian jumped off the machine and squared off in front of Pete and said, "You called me a name. Will you please take it back what you said?" The Bulgarian's eyes were like cast steel, and the hammer was going up and down with an oily motion, and the hand was holding a big chunk of red steel on the anvil. And for a minute or two they stood there, and then Pete said, "Sure, I'll take it back. Working under a roof all the time and never getting out in the sun makes a man yellow." If they had been used to working outdoors, they would have gone to the railroad yards after work, and there, between the rows of boxcars, they would have had a good fight. And after that, they would have been friends. We wanted to see a fight, but we didn't. Pete was yellow. He was a big man, but he looked like he'd been shrunk and hardened in hot oil like a Ford spring. His face and his neck were like leather, and it looked like there was smoke in his hair, and heat from the steel and the fires had done something to him inside. It seemed like the heat had fried every bit of goodness out of his nature. Every man on the floor was scared of him, and every man hated the ground he spit on. That little trouble didn't amount to much, but it was the start of everything that happened. Things went along for a while, and then one day the Bulgarian got a notice from the front office to turn in his badge. He was fired. It was shady work, and Pete was behind it, and the Bulgarian knew it, but he acted dumb and said nothing. And then they couldn't get anybody that could run the machine, and a lot of work piled up on the floor, and a couple of high-collars came down out of the front office and talked to Pete with loud voices. And they sent a wire to the Bulgarian, and he came back. He came down on the floor with his new clothes, but before he put on his overalls or put a hand on the lever, the superintendent had to raise him to 48, and that was against the rules, because when you're working with steel, the hammerman gives the orders, and Pete was only getting 720. Sorry, I'm going to reread that sentence. He came back to the floor in his new clothes, but before he came down to the floor, he came down to the floor in his new clothes, but before he'd put on his overalls or put a hand on the lever, the superintendent had to raise him to 840. And that was against the rules, because when you're working with steel, the hammerman gives the orders, and Pete was only getting 720. After that, Pete hated the Bulgarian like poison, and the Bulgarian hated Pete, and yet every piece of steel they handled, they had to work on together. They didn't talk to each other no more than they had to. And pretty soon, partly because of the noise and partly because they hated each other, Pete started using signals, and after a while, he gave the Bulgarian all his orders that way. And at last, they got so they never said a word to each other the whole day. When they were working on a job that was tricky, it was fun to see the way Pete could tell the Bulgarian what to do, or how to hold the steel under the hammer, just by a jerk of the head, or a little twist of the thumb, or the way he would spread his four fingers and hold his hand for a second, pointing downward. Everybody thought Pete was mighty smart to be able to do it, but it was the Bulgarian who was the one that was smart, because he was the one that had to know what all the little signs meant. Day after day, the Bulgarian got to be more expert with his machine. Visitors would come through the factory, and they would think it was a pretty swell sight to see Pete stand behind the green glass and the big hammer coming down on the hot steel, and the sparks shooting out in a 20-foot circle. The hammer would make the ground shake, and the building would rattle. But if there was anybody in the crowd that knew anything about machinery, they watched Bulgarian Bill in the hand. He would be standing behind his control levers with his eye on Pete, getting the signals, and the big hand would tilt the steel a little, or turn it, or bring it a little forward or backward, or put it down on the floor to get a new hold, and you'd hear the click of the switches, and the Bulgarian's hands on the levers would be as fast as greased lightning. Off the machine, he was easy-going and slow and sober, and when he started out to say something, you'd know what it was before he had the words out of his mouth. But when he got his hands on the levers, he was as slick and as fast as a cat. If you watched him more than 3 or 4 minutes, you'd forget that he was a man, and you'd get to feel that he was just a complicated part of the hand. Once, one of the helpers got up on the machine and touched one of the levers and got a shock. "Judas," he said, "there's juice in them levers." "That is static," said the Bulgarian. "It is good for the nerves and the brain." To us fellows who worked on the floor, the machine was just a complicated piece of machinery that had a lot of electrical things in it. But to the Bulgarian, it was more, and we noticed after a while that he acted as if he was sort of stuck on it, like a high school kid with his first girl. Pete noticed it too, and pretty soon he started taking out his spite on the machine. He chewed tobacco, and whenever he got the chance, he would plaster tobacco juice on the hand. Or when the machine would roll past his hammer, like as not, he would open the relief cock in the cylinder and let out a blast of oily steam and hot water. When it got near quitting time, his fellows that worked on the floor didn't think about anything except how to get out of the factory as quick as possible. 20 minutes before it was time for the bell, we'd have our aprons rolled up, and our tools in a pile, and our dinner buckets standing where we could grab them on a run. But the Bulgarian, when the bell rang, he'd go off after a handful of waste and a bunch of old rags, and put in a half hour on his own time, rubbing the dried tobacco juice off the hand or polishing the brass of the levers, and fooling around to see that everything was okay. He'd never leave the factory until he was sure Pete had gone out the front gate, and if some little thing got out of whack with the machines, he acted like a sick cat until it was fixed, and sometimes he would even spend half the night in the factory without pay helping the mechanics. Even during the lunch hour he would fool around with his machine, doing little things to it or trying to make himself more expert and practicing stunts with the hand like opening windows or taking the dinner buckets off the bench and putting them up on the shelf, or trying to pick milk bottles off the floor without bursting them. He was a nut when it came to doing things with machinery. One day, they got